Yes, I think all of you heard that now. Yes, so as usual in Zoom meetings, I kindly ask you to keep the mic off if you are not the one holding the floor. That helps, I think. And because we're a considerably large number of people and maybe a round of introduction will take too long, I'd like to encourage you to perhaps make use of the technology advent and write on the chat perhaps your name and affiliation, position, where you speak from, if you will. I think it'll be a nice way for all of us to have an idea of who's here and who is also joining us here. More two people, nice. Yes. So before we start the discussion, I'd like to make a very brief presentation of the history of this group, because today actually marks a new phase of our group, because we started back in August 2018 when I was visiting one of my supervisors, Alistair Pennycook at University of Technology, Sydney. And we wanted to discuss a book that had been published recently, Mignolo and Walsh's On Decoloniality. And then Alistair mentioned, Makoni's been reading that book. Maybe he would be interested in discussing it as well. And then a few of us got together online for the first time then, and it's been almost 2 years now. This is our 10th meeting, in which I mentioned this is a new phase. We have the honor of having the author Tim Ingold here with us to discuss the life of lines. Yes, before I pass on the floor to Sinfree to make a proper introduction of Tim Ingold, a few words to thank people who have been making this possible. So Magda has been an active member of our group, and she's been helping us with defining the best structure to make the most of our meetings, and she has inviting more and more people, and now we're almost reaching the 20th participant in today's meeting. It's a record already. And she's been an active member of the discussions also, so thank you, Magda. I don't see Desmond here, who's been another very important member, and he took over the organization while I was finishing up my thesis last semester, so thank you, Desmond, wherever you are. And yes, then welcome everyone, especially those who are here for the first time. And another, of course, very important member is Makoni, who from the beginning has been perhaps the most enthusiastic. And I think if it wasn't for him, it wouldn't have lasted this long. So I'll now pass the floor to Makoni, who will introduce Tim Ingold.
Yes, okay, it's a great pleasure to have all of you joining us in this exciting group. I think Raphael is right to say what happened was just by chance that we, the three of us, including Lynn Mario, got together to discuss a series of books. And the other unsaid story about this was that at that point we were struggling with trying to make sense of what Southern theories could offer, which critical theories couldn't. So we decided that let's try and see if we can read books that we normally wouldn't do unless we find ourselves compelled to do so. So we then began to identify a number of different books, and I think we've read about 8 or 10. And Tim Ingold's book, The Life of Lines, came into the picture when I reached out to somebody called Peter Jones. I needed some reference on music, etc. Then he says, oh, have you read this guy's work? And then he gave me some references. Then through some other colleague, mutual friend between me and Adrian, called David Bede, he then sent an email to Tim, inviting him to come and join us. So it has been very interesting and exciting to come together like this. And like Raphael is saying, this marks the beginning of another phase when we have the authors discussing their work with us. After this, we are going to have a session in which Monica Heller and Bonnie McQueenie will be discussing their book, Language, Capitalism, and Colonialism, and we'll just continue like that, and we'll see what happens. So let me then just briefly introduce Tim. Tim was the former chair of social anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. He's a social anthropologist, and his doctoral research work was on the Saami in northeast Finland, in which he was looking at the ecological adaptation among ecological adaptations and issues about resettlement. He then kept coming back to similar themes, in which he was now focusing on hunting, pastoralism, and ranching. And one of the themes that seem to run through his work is the complex relationship between humans and animals, and the conceptualization of that interface between humanity and animals. He's interested in comparative anthropology, and he keeps asking himself, I think, the question, what is an animal? Key themes that is interesting to us, I think, is the connection that he seems to make between themes like walking, observing, and writing, which from an applied linguistic perspective, I think this would be very interesting to some of my colleagues like Jason to think that there is a connection we can make between writing and walking, so it would be interesting. And he then researches into what he calls the 4 A's: anthropology, archaeology, arts, and architecture. He has written a number of books, and the following are some that I could easily identify: Lines, A Brief History, Perception of the Environment, Being Alive, Essays on Movement, Hunting, Pastoralists, and Ranching, and then another one on Key Debates on Anthropology, then Tools, Language, and Cognition. Tim, thank you very much for finding the time to come and join us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. I'm just amazed by so many people from so many different parts of the world. It's extraordinary what this is possible.
Yeah.
So thank you for having me.
Yeah.
And greetings from Scotland.
What we're going to do now is we'll begin, Raphael will give you a series of questions. Is that the way you want us to proceed, Raphael? Or do you want Tim to talk about his work first and you ask the questions? You want? Can you hear me?
Oh, you couldn't hear me. Now, yes, I was on mute, yes.
Yes, I was saying that, do you want to ask, do you want Tim to talk about his books first, or do you want to ask him the specific questions that were sent to you? How do you want to structure it now?
Well, Tim, if you could perhaps make a brief intro to the book, and then I will start with the questions. I was really happy that I received around 10 questions, and we thought that I would try to compile these questions for the first 30 minutes, and then we would open up for discussion. For discussions, okay.
Okay, well, if I can try and remember to give it a brief introduction to the book. I had originally written a book about lines, which was published in 2007. And the basis for that was that if we think about life as something that is lived along lines rather than a particular point, that's a way of bringing walking, drawing, storytelling, lots of other things, writing together, and movement and gesture. All these things become instances of line making. So I wrote this book looking at what the different sorts of lines were, but I always had a feeling that I should write another book, a sequel, and that's what The Life of Lines was. So originally, before I gave it a title, it was simply known as Lines 2, Lines 2 sequel. But the reason I felt I had to write it was that I felt intuitively that there was some kind of connection between lines and the weather. I couldn't quite figure out what it was, and or between linealogy and meteorology, and I wanted to see how these two could be connected. And then in the end, the second part of that book was about that, really about the relations between lines and the weather. But I also began to think that that if we could reimagine the world as something that is not built from blocks, not put together from pieces, but woven together from lines of one sort and another, we could get a completely different picture of what the world is like, and also about what social life is like and what human beings are like. And it was actually, I was spending some time as a fellow at the at an institute in Weimar in Germany, and staying in a little house that used to belong to the secretary of Goethe. And I remember one morning at breakfast, I sat down and I wrote a whole list of chapters, which I more or less stuck to. That was in spring 2014. I wrote down the structure of this book in about an hour. And then I decided that I was going to write a book which consisted of lots and lots of very, very short chapters. So that's how it came out. And it was a pleasure to write, because I wrote much of it in a little cottage that we stay at when we can in the summers in eastern Finland. And I could sit down and a chapter could be a day's work. So I could just sit down and say, I'll write this chapter, a couple of thousand words, that's it, that's done. And then I do another one, and then another one. So it was a very, very nice and easy book to write. And it's still one that I think it's my favorite book. But that's enough of background. I just have to get up very quickly to put the thing in my battery so it doesn't run out. Just a second.
While he's at it, I would just like to mention that I'm going to follow my suggestions to post all the questions here in the chat. Yeah, I'm posting all the questions here in the chat just for the record, but then, yeah, we'll get back to it. Please carry on.
No, anyway, I finished. You start on.
So,
yes. Thank you for your introduction, Tim. I'm posting here the questions in the chat. I was thinking of selecting some of them to ask you now, and then we'll open to the discussion. So we don't need to follow all the questions that are the order of the questions, right? And I would like to start by asking you about a passage in the preface in which you talk about your trajectory coming from ethnography to philosophy, and meeting the scholar in the middle, coming from philosophy to ethnography, and then you meet in the middle where things get interesting. I was wondering if you could perhaps elaborate a bit more about how you see this trajectory of yours, why the middle point is where things get interesting, and the ways in which it might be reflected in this book.
I mean, I think of anthropology as a kind of philosophy, a way of doing philosophy in the world by engaging with the world around us rather than engaging simply with canonical literature. And so I think we can do philosophy better than the philosophers can. And my problem with philosophy has always been that I can never understand a word of what they're talking about unless or until I've already more or less thought it out for myself. Because once I'm on the same wavelength, once I've thought something through in my own way, through an engagement with things around me, then I can begin to see and it agrees with what some philosopher is writing. Then I can begin to understand what they're saying. But I can never understand what they're saying from zero, so to speak, from a ground zero. I have to have already more or less thought my way through, and then maybe the philosopher will help me move a little bit further, though not very much. So, to my mind, the kinds of questions that we've been asking in anthropology are fundamentally philosophical questions. They're questions about how human beings live, learn, remember, perceive, act, form themselves into collectivities, deal with death, respond to illness. These are all basically philosophical questions. But what anthropology does is to address those questions through an engagement with other people and also with everything else in the world. We do our philosophy out of doors, so to speak, rather than by going back to a canonical literary tradition and critiquing it and engaging with it. And that's really what in the Life of Lines, that's what I was trying to do. So it is I suppose it's a philosophical book, and it's addressing philosophical questions, but I hope that it's addressing them through observing, attending to, paying attention to very ordinary things, like the weather, like how you tie a knot in a piece of string, like how you put two pieces of wood together. That's what I find sort of fascinating. I love to think in that kind of way. And I think it leads to better philosophy, and certainly more comprehensible.
Thank you. And besides the more simple things that you've cited that you use to make reference to in your book, there are many references to songs and art also. And one question that I received was, would your views and metaphors of songs and art be different if the sources were indigenous or African? For example, what would be the analytical conclusion if the artists were Saami?
Well, probably rather similar, because when I think back and wonder, why is it that I'm thinking in a particular way, or finding some ways of thinking congenial and other ways of thinking uncongenial, and I wonder, why is that? And I attribute it to things that I've picked up along the way. So, for example, I was asking myself, what is it about lines that I found so exciting? And one of the key influences, I think, has been the kind of formative education that I underwent doing fieldwork with Saami people a long time ago. And at the time, I was just doing what you're supposed to do as an anthropologist, collecting kinship data, doing household surveys, doing all this stuff, writing it up in a very fairly sort of detailed, low-level ethnography. And I hadn't really realized until much later how much I had really absorbed about sort of ontologically, about ways of being, about ways of attending to the world, simply from the lessons in life that I'd had from living amongst Saami people. It is a kind of, I am on the same wavelength, I think, as the way Saami people are thinking, and indeed more generally among northern circumpolar people, because there are very big parallels all around the circumpolar north in the way people tend to think about things. So the way Saami people do it is very similar to the way in which indigenous people around that region think. And I think it really has, it has got sort of, by a kind of osmosis, it's got absorbed into my own way of thinking, so I don't even realize always that I'm doing it. And had I been working in Africa or China or wherever, the same thing would have happened. I would have probably absorbed ways of thinking, maybe without realizing it, and that would then have affected the way I write. And that's the great richness of anthropology, because other anthropologists who've worked in other regions might sort of be on different wavelengths because of the people they've worked with, but that all adds up to the richness of it.
Thank you. And another question that I received has to do with the, I think it's the title of the third part, humaning. It relates to the key verb humaning in relation to an ongoing shift in the human sciences, broadly wherein things, nouns are being argued as verbs. So language, languaging, mathematics, mathematizing, identity, identitying. I've been contributing, this was Sanjita's question, to this shift for a while, in particular by attending to our global North hegemonic stances related to language and identity. As such, I wonder why this larger shift is not taken up in any manner or anywhere in this very interesting book. Is this broader shift taking place outside of anthropology and all the other disciplinary areas that you are invested in?
I think it is. I keep bumping into it in other disciplines. It maybe more in other disciplines actually than in anthropology itself. I mean, I've been trying to push for the. I always find that when I'm faced with an intellectual puzzle, a problem, that if I turn from the noun to the verb, it usually helps to solve it. That it's a really useful move to make. But for example, I was contributing to a book that's actually edited by two literary scholars who work in the field of eco-criticism. It's called Veer Ecology, the book, and it's a follow-up to a book they edited called Elementary Eco-Criticism. These were literary scholars, but as a contributor, or all the contributors to this book, there were about 30 of them, were instructed to choose a particular verb. And the whole thing was that we were supposed to, I mean, my verb was whirl, but we were all supposed to think and write in terms of verbs. So that's clearly caught on there. And I don't know, I can't remember how many different fields, but I keep bumping into this same move. It's one because in so many different disciplines, people have been falling over the subject-object dichotomy. They know that there's something wrong with the subject-object dichotomy, and they've been trying to find a way out of it. But often the ways they find simply end up reproducing it and get to the difficulty. And if there's one thing that really helps to overcome it, it is this turning from the noun to the verb. But there was another thing that was really critical. I'd like to mention it, and that is the middle voice of the verb. That was something that I discovered whilst I was attending an ecological conference, actually, and somebody mentioned it, and I didn't know anything about it, and then I looked into it, and I found this is really, really important. It's how we can talk about what we undergo as something we also do. How we can be inside the action, the middle voice of the verb, as opposed to the active or the passive. What you do is being done in you. You're inside the action. It's not that you start the action and then it has a consequence, like the boy kicked the ball, or the ball was kicked by the boy, but you are inside that action of kicking a ball. And I found, so that then the verb takes primacy over its objects and its subjects. And I found that hugely helpful. It solves so many riddles for me.
Makoni, would you like to ask a couple of questions maybe before we open?
Before we open up, yes. Yes, I have a couple of questions. As I was going through your book, The Life of Lines, I kept asking myself whether conceptually your notion of life is being impacted now by the COVID era, for example. Your idea of life now slightly different from what it was in the pro-COVID era?
No, not really. I'm very reluctant to come up with sort of instant knee-jerk responses to the current situation. It's not been going on for very long. It certainly hasn't been going on for long enough for us to be able to think really deeply about it. So it's, in a sense, it's too soon. But like many people, I've had the feeling that we have, before this came, the whole world was caught up in a huge global machine, which was accelerating and taking us very rapidly over what we all knew was the cliff edge, and yet nobody seemed to have the power to pause it. And no human, nobody on this earth, no human, seemed to have the power to stop the acceleration of this machine that was eventually would take us over the cliff completely. So now this virus has done it. I mean, this virus has done what we all said was completely impossible, to stop the economy, stop growth just for a moment, so that we can sit and reflect on them for just for a while on how we can do things differently. And a lot of people are reflecting on that, and we will have to do things differently. And in that sense, we can put a positive gloss on the whole thing, that it's caused an immense amount of suffering, but it has also done something to us that was very, very necessary.
Then following,
yes.
My official first name is Sinfree. So when I was reading your book on page 141, when you were talking about God, when you said God needs no imagination, that struck me very well. So I wanted you to elaborate what you meant by saying God needs no imagination. His creation is already all in place before the act begins. Does that mean God is an unimaginative, uncreative individual in the way you are framing?
Well, it seemed to me that it's for mortals, people like us, that we can hope and we can dream. And we can hope and we can dream because we are but mortal, and like St. Augustine said, I mean, we can only apprehend the world one piece at a time. We can't get the totality. We can't get the whole of it, because we're inside this. We're inside the passage of time. We're inside the movement of history, which only reveals itself as it goes along. And because of that we can hope and we can dream. But if you were God, you couldn't. I mean, God could not hope about anything. God could not dream about anything. Because, well, it depends on what you mean by God. I like I've been thinking about recently about medieval ideas about creativity, and how we could think of God not as a creator of the world, but as creation itself. It's almost like saying, let's make God a verb. Let's say that God is the process, the action of creating a world, and that we're inside that movement of creation that is going on all the time. So I'm thinking about it in that kind of way. But I'm not myself one of the puzzling things is that I grew up in a thoroughly atheistic household. I'm not myself affiliated to any religion. If anybody asked me whether I believed in God, I would say no. But curiously, through thinking about these things, I found myself engaging more and more with theologians, and actually paying a great deal of respect to a lot of theological arguments, and because I think we have a lot to learn from them.
Yeah, and one of the books that we read in this group was by Eduardo de Vieiro de Castro. Yeah, you cite him a bit, let's say on page 123 on perspectivism. In what way is your work similar or different from the work by Viviero di Castro?
Eduardo. Well, we're old friends, and Eduardo has been very. He's been the architect in anthropology of a very strong movement towards perspectivism, which I don't want to try and explain now. It would take too long, but he's coming from a background of anthropological fieldwork in Amazonia with indigenous Amazonian people, where there's a very clear idea of that people can transform into animals and vice versa, and that what he would call the human is a field of subjectivity that underlies any differences that we might call natural between one species and another. And I have a lot of time for this view. I don't fundamentally disagree with it, but it is just a little bit too much like a clever intellectual exercise. So we have Western naturalism. Nature underpins all sorts of differences of culture. The Parisian intellectual in Eduardo says, what happens if we could just invert that and say that what underpins everything is spirit or culture or something like that, and then all the natural differences are on top instead. And my only quarrel with it is that this kind of intellectual inversion doesn't allow scope for what I want to call ontogenesis, that is the becoming of being. The arguments in perspectivism, for and against, have all been ontological arguments. They've all been about what is the nature of being, what domains of being are there, and how do they relate to one another, nature, culture, whatever. But for my mind, that's not enough, because philosophies are not given to humans ready-made. That people come to think one way and another, and often they come to think in very different ways, even in the same society. That people don't all think the same thing, and they're arguing about it a lot. So that philosophies, ontologies, are not ready-made on a plate. They have themselves continually to become within processes of growth and conversation that are going on among people who are wondering about how they came to be here, what their relations with animals, what does existence mean, all these questions that we're all concerned about. So I want to shift back from, and it's very central to the life of lines, shifting back from questions of ontology to questions of ontogeny, not from philosophies of being to generations of being. And that's where this notion of humaning comes in, because humaning, to treat the human as a verb, is to take human, or what is human, is to take that as a fundamentally ontogenetic question. How you become humans, or how humans become, rather than what humans are.
So if your interest is in how you become human, conceptually then issues about post-humanism will be incompatible with the way you are currently thinking.
In many ways, yes. I don't like, or at least I feel very uneasy about much of the rhetoric of post-humanism. I think sometimes I would say to post-humanists that they should be careful what they wish for. For a number of reasons. One is that just the post in post-humanism. The trouble with post is that it implies a before and after. It actually implies a linear conception of history. And yet if there's one thing that post-humanists say they're against, it's a linear conception of history. So one of the contradictions in post-humanism, I think, is that they are still constructing the trajectory of the of intellectual of the history of thought in a linear way, and they're putting post-humanism on that line, and that seems to me to be flying in the face of everything that they're trying to say. So there's something wrong with the post. There's also something wrong, I think, with the reduction of post-humanism, as often happens, to a kind of anti-humanism. And we know that humanism has done a lot of damage. It's done a lot of damage in terms of the effect of unbridled growth on the environment, and it's done a lot of damage in terms of colonialism and the disenfranchisement and genocide that went along with that. We know, that humanism, the growth of humanism historically was inseparable from the growth of the whole colonial movement, and we know the damage that's done. That is all true. But humanism has also brought us public health, democracy, universal education, literacy, much longer lifespans. And I somehow balk when affluent American philosophers from California or somewhere turn to people in Africa or in India, people who maybe have never really enjoyed good public health care, never enjoyed universal education, who've never enjoyed the benefits of democracy. And they say to these people, I'm sorry you've missed the bus. Humanism's gone. We're in the post-human world now. You can't say that to people. So we have, whatever comes after humanism must not be an anti-humanism. It must not be a rejection of humanism. It must be something that builds on it, that incorporates what is best of humanism and moves us on. And that's why I feel very, very ambivalent about a lot of the pronouncements that I see coming out of post-humanism, although I'm sympathetic to a lot of what it stands for. I mean, I'm sympathetic, obviously, to breaking down the boundaries between humanity and nature, and I'm sympathetic to much of the new materialism, and sympathetic to thinking about living in a more than human world. All these things I'm sympathetic to, but I'm very unsympathetic to some of the rhetoric that goes along with it.
May I ask a question? Okay. I'm not even sure how to phrase it, but you have argued that the post-humanism logic, particularly the construct of assemblage, it really uses the logic of the logic is additive, and you proposed the idea of web instead of and I wondered if you could elaborate on it a little bit. And I started to think about Karen Barad's idea of interaction and how web is different from that.
I've taken that quite a bit further in the last few years. I mean, since I wrote this book. So it's a little difficult. I'm looking back at the book and thinking, oh, it's not quite good enough. I've got to take this further. So firstly, on the assemblage, assemblage in the Brian Masumi translation of Deleuze and Guattari's Meal Plateau is a translation of the French word agencement, and that's really what we have to talk about. And agencement is difficult because it's almost untranslatable into English. But I think the power of the concept in Deleuze is precisely lies in its ambiguity. That is that it allows us to switch back, flip back and forth, if you like, or transition between an additive view and a contrapuntal view, between the and with. And in later work, not in the Life of Lines book, but in later work, I've made a distinction in English between the assemblage, which is additive, and the gathering, which is contrapuntal. It actually maps on to the Latin distinction between those words that start with the prefix ad, like adjoin or aggregate, and those words that begin with the prefix con, like conjoin or congregate. There are a whole lot of words that can take those alternative prefixes, and one means kind of atness, and the other withness. And I think the beauty of the concept of agencement is that it enables us to show how you can't really have one without the other, but how they are different, and how showing the relationship between withness and andness can tell us a lot about how things form, but why those formations don't last. So what I've been trying to do is to see how we can put those together, rather than reducing them all to either everything is and or everything is with. That's taking things quite a bit beyond what I was able to do in the book, which was really just the first attempt at all this. And in thinking this through, I have ended up in very much the same position as Karen Barad, that is true. But I think in a footnote somewhere in the Life of Lines, I explain why I don't like the concept of interaction. And instead, I've been developing the concept, which I also introduced in this book, kind of for the first time, and that's the notion of correspondence. I much prefer correspondence to interaction. Correspondence means things going along together and answering to one another as they go. Things going along together and differentiating themselves and answering to one another as they go. The best example of that being, of course, the musical counterpoint or a fugue, something like that, where you have lots of lines, choral lines or instrumental lines going along together, continually differentiating themselves from one another and yet answering to one another from the inside. And in the Life of Lines book, I call that interstitial differentiation. The trouble with interaction is that it takes interaction and simply turns it around by 180 degrees. I want to turn it by 90 degrees, not by 180 degrees. So the interaction is not the opposite of interaction. It's not intra versus inter. It's a 90-degree rotation, such as you get if you stop thinking about how do I get from this side of the river to that side of the river to, well, where is the water going? The water in the river is going in a direction orthogonal to the line that would link places on either bank. And that's where I want to go with correspondence. And I just don't think that interaction does that. It's not that I disagree with Karen, it's just that I think she's got the wrong word.
Lynn.
Can I ask a question?
Thank you.
Mario, did you have a question?
Yes.
Yes.
Can I? Well, Sinfree was going to say something.
No. I was asking you whether you wanted to intervene.
Oh, yeah, I do. The two things. One, in the contrapuntal aspect interests me, but I come to this from Edward Said, who nearly 30 years ago talked about counterpoint and the importance of being contrapuntal in challenging master narratives, which was, or the colonial discourse. And also coming back, making a connection with what you said about Eduardo Viveros de Castro, whose work I also engage with. And your reading is that it may be another kind of left bank response to, right?
Yes.
But I wonder, looking at it from a political point of view, what he's doing is he's saying that knowledge is always located, right?
Yes.
So when he's saying knowledge is located and this location may be shifting, what he's saying is that knowledge which comes without any, which sees itself as being unmarked and therefore coming from nowhere, right, needs to rethink itself, perhaps. You know, and I think,
yeah,
I think that's a challenge he's making. Where he's basically saying that in his work, if you see, ethnography becomes anthropology, becomes philosophy. Right?
yes,
And if we remember that. Why ethnography appeared in the first place was because it was ethnography as distancing or separating itself or extending anthropology was because it recognized the fact that there may be another point of view, the native's point of view. So whereas anthropology was at this, let's say, armchair level to say that, yeah, let's think about the world, whereas anthropology had more of the philosophical aspect of not looking at specifics. Ethnography wanted to go out into the field and look at, have access to the native's point of view. So the contribution of ethnography was to challenge the single point of view, right? Even though it goes into other complexities as it comes along. So if we challenge the single point of view, then we come from a contrapuntal perspective. Then we do come to a and with, because once we seek a voice and we say, just a minute, we are here, this is what Edward Said was doing 30, 40 years ago as a he didn't call himself anti-colonial or post-colonial at the time, but as from a colonized perspective, he was saying the point of view of history that the conqueror tells is just one point of view. There are other points of view. And if we apply this to science and modernity, we are saying that knowledge also has points of view involved. And so that's how I read your work as saying, yes, we have, when we look at science, knowledge, anthropology, philosophy, there are other parallel sciences, knowledges, philosophies, right? And our relationship with them, initially when we see them, may be an and relationship. But when we begin to engage with them, then we can move from an and to a with relationship. I don't know.
Yes, I agree with you. I largely agree with you. And I agree with Eduardo on that. I mean, Eduardo's project is to decolonize anthropology. And it's one with which one could hardly disagree. I mean, I'm entirely with him in that. And his view, which is also mine, is fundamental to anthropology that we take others seriously. And taking seriously poses certain challenges which anthropology has up until recently not been very good at addressing. So we have a long tradition saying, of course, it goes back to Geertz, there is the native point of view. But traditionally, anthropology has absorbed the native point of view by saying that we can recognize that as an emic level, something that makes sense in their terms. But it's we who see it. We see the native point of view because we are basically above it. And we can therefore survey these different points of view from an Olympian position above them all. But there is no such Olympian position. So the question is then, what do we do in such a way that we don't simply end up, as much of anthropology has, with a multiplication of possible worlds? So, for example, I recently wrote a paper called One World Anthropology. I didn't mean the one world of British Airways or of corporate finance, but I meant that we do actually live in one world and not many worlds. And that is a world of it's what William James called a multiverse or a pluriverse. It's a world of infinite difference and differentiation that is continually coming into being. And that means that we have to go beyond simply the recognition of alternative points of view. We have to go beyond that to engage in a conversation, not just about what kinds of thought, or what kinds of lives are there, but what kind of life might be possible. So I think the fundamental question for anthropology is not how do all these different people live, it is how should we live? And what we then have to do is to bring the conversations we have with people everywhere into that question. And it's a question that we can't answer finally, obviously, but it's a question that we can bring in to our lives, thinking of every life as a kind of experiment in collective being. And we have all these experiments going on, and we've got to learn from one another. So for me, taking people seriously means that we're not making studies of people, but we are going to study with them. Just as you go to study with your professor or with a master musician or something like that. We go to study with people in order to learn something from them. Not simply to repeat what they do, but to think that, well, what we learn might actually help us together to forge a better way of living. And on those grounds, I've been insisting, I've got myself into a lot of trouble from my colleagues for this, but I've been insisting that ethnography and anthropology are quite different. Not because anthropology does the philosophizing and ethnography simply writes up the details, but because they're asking different questions. Ethnography is asking the question, or ethnography is fundamentally a descriptive enterprise. It's a graphy. It is describing with care, with nuance, with subtlety, with fidelity, what life is like for these particular people, whoever they may be, at this particular time. And that's fine. And we need that kind of knowledge. We need to know how other people are living, what conditions they face, how they manage. Anthropology, in my definition, is a generous, open-ended, comparative and critical inquiry into the conditions and possibilities of life in the one world we all inhabit. That's to say, it's fundamentally a speculative question about how can we live? How can human beings live in the world? We don't have the answers to it, but we can learn from what we know from the conversations we have with other people. And getting back right to the point I made at the beginning, that's what it means to be doing our philosophy in the world. By having our conversations with people anywhere, everywhere, or even non-humans we might be conversing with, rather than restricting our philosophical discourse to engagements in the library with canonical texts in a mostly Western tradition. That's why I think anthropology can be so much better philosophy than the philosophy that philosophers do.
Stephanie, what do you think? Given your experience of carrying out anthropological research in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, Stephanie, what's your view?
Sorry, I missed that. Was that a question addressed to me or to somebody else in the group? I just did a little bit of
that. Yeah, I was trying to get.
Now. Okay.
yes,
well, I think it's I must really thank Tim for this, because it's an incredibly provocating thought for me. For me, anthropology was basically synonymous with ethnography. So I never really thought of these two as distinctive, but I think to a large extent I agree with the fact that ethnography is descriptive. So as far as to, let's say, how you've really now twisted my mind here.
I just lost you for a bit because of some glitches with the connection, so I missed some words in the middle. But it's a big debate that's going on at the moment, and I felt that it's a debate that is important to have, because anthropologists have been. I mean, we do have an in-house understanding amongst ourselves as anthropologists when we talk about ethnography. we know what we mean, and we know that it's more than just recording how people live, that it's much of just what I said anthropology is. The problem comes when explaining what we're doing to people outside anthropology. And we've been very, very bad at that. I mean, most people outside anthropology have not got the faintest idea what the subject is about, have very misleading idea. And there's still the idea that what anthropologists are there because they call themselves ethnographers, then what they're there to do is simply to kind of provide the raw material, the data about the beliefs and practices of other people that can then be fed into the models of other disciplines, of historians and economists, and psychologists, and they do a generally disastrous job of it. And therefore, it's really important that we as anthropologists can say, we have a voice of our own. It's not our job to be speaking for the other people with whom we study. They can speak for themselves, or there might be other organs through which that is done. But we have important things to say because we've been thinking about things very carefully and in depth through our engagements with others. But what we say, I think, publicly, what we say is something for which we should take ownership, say this is what we say, rather than transposing it on and saying, oh no, what we're doing is just rendering what they say. And I think this is really critically important, because otherwise anthropologists are going to continue to be excluded from the fields of public debate where they've been needed as never before. So you see, it's largely a question about our external relations rather than our internal understanding of one another. Anyway, this is a big thing.
Yeah, jump in. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. I have been influenced by your works. Your Why It Matters has been very useful, very helpful, very insightful for me in the kind of anthropological research that we do around here, where we used to think that anthropology was just going and have the gaze of the all-seeing person and then get what people think they are doing, much like a spy, and then come away and begin to analyze them. So it has changed my perspective about what to do, and it has actually caused me to even think of myself as the subject of my own research, whatever that means. Okay, so, but for this particular book, and this particular discussion, I'm sorry to drag it a bit too long because I know that others have other things to say. But I have had this understanding that anthropology, being trained under the British tradition before I started venturing and reading the other things about the American anthropology and the other European societies, I've had this understanding that anthropology has different sub-disciplines, if you like, different agents. Like ethnography is one of those. Ethnography is about going to get primary data. Ethnology is about comparative ethnography, that is comparing data and trying to draw conclusions from here and there. And I also know that in doing ethnology, theorizing has to come into it. You have to. And today, I also know about things like critical ethnography, for example, where you do not just allow what people say to speak to you, but you take your own position about your values, your judgment about what is going on there to make your argument about how the world should be, how people should be treated, how government should behave differently, and the rest. Yeah, so I'm just wondering whether this is different from what people in your circle have known you know, that has caused this trouble, you know, between you and them when you mention that ethnography is not anthropology. I also want to hear from you, you know, is ethnography not part of anthropology? Do we have to quarrel with that?
Okay, just a little hard to hear some of your words, but because of the interference on the line. But it's really difficult because anthropology, it's a very diffuse, very scattered discipline. It has all sorts of different regional, local traditions, different nomenclatures. So, you know, what ethnology means in one country is different from what it means in another, and it's in some ways very fragmented. And it's just the opposite of a discipline that could be regarded as somehow really cohesive, and you could say this is what it is, and everybody agrees on it. In fact, nobody can really agree on what it is at all, and much of the time I'm not sure. I often say that I'm not sure whether I'm an anthropologist or not, and the reason why I've stayed in anthropology is and still think of myself as an anthropologist is because what's great about it is that you can think what you like. The degree of intellectual freedom and methodological freedom, ethical freedom, and the ability actually to do your own thing in anthropology is hugely greater than in most other academic disciplines, history or psychology or economics. Goodness knows, they're all caught in rather restricting paradigms. And the great thing about anthropology is that very strong commitment to any paradigm. Well, not for a long time, not since the days of structural functionalism in the 1950s have we been, you know, had a really dominant paradigm. So you can do what you want, but that also means that there are lots of people who call themselves anthropologists, things that I think are entirely wrong, and the biggest difficulty I have, along with many of my colleagues, is what we do with the biological anthropologists. The biological anthropologists really are, to a large extent, locked into a paradigm that is actually intolerable. I mean, it's intolerable to anybody who would start from the premise that we should take other people seriously. Because so far as they're concerned, people are simply acting out their inherited traits. They might be cultural traits or the genetic traits. They're puppets who are acting out their traits and reproducing them in the process. And that's simply not acceptable to any intellectual discipline that professes to take what other people think seriously and to learn from it. And that's a big problem. We have to reconcile it in anthropology. But I think actually that this problem is not restricted to anthropology. I think it's a problem that runs through the entire constitution of the academy. And it's a problem, actually, to get back to an earlier discussion, to which post-humanism has very largely emerged as a reaction. And it's a problem between that old, established sense of what the academy is, what it's for, and what it does, which is to develop a superior knowledge of the ways of the world, which will then enlighten everybody else. And our post-colonial understanding, if you will, which is said, no, we don't have any superior knowledge. We have to have lots and lots of people who know a lot of things, and we need to be talking to one another. And anthropology has been caught in that dilemma for a long, long time, because it's one of the few academic disciplines that has been prepared to listen to what people say and to learn from them. Most other academic disciplines don't bother. They simply treat what people say as something which tells them something about the people. They look into attitudes and things like that, as revealing something. So anthropology has faced this dilemma for a long time, but it's a dilemma that runs through, I think, the entire academic pantheon, and that we're currently struggling with anthropology as much as anything else. I don't know. your question. But
I think, yes, I think you're raising a very important question about the nature of the academy. I would like to draw in Anne Gemati on this particular issue because she has been working on issues that address the nature of the academy and arguments about trying to decolonize sociolinguistics. Anna, do you want to have a comment on it? Do you want to comment on it?
Hi,
Yes.
everybody. Sorry for joining late. I was in another meeting. I'm listening intently and don't really have a comment at the moment because I'm trying still to fully understand the argument and its complexity. So do you?
Okay, that's fine.
I don't have a direct comment.
Is there anybody who wants to jump in?
I would like to, if no one else who hasn't spoken before would have anything to say, I'd like to come back to something, if I may. Does anyone else have a question? I'm willing to pass.
Why don't you tell them, just jump in, move on to Mary, she wants to come in again. Yeah.
Coming back into your distinction between ontology and ontogeny and these comments you just made about biological anthropology. For those of us who work with, let's say, decolonial theory and decolonial analysis, it's very difficult to make a distinction between ontology and ontogeny from a historical political perspective, because if we define ontogeny as the generating of being, historically, when we look at certain societies, especially amongst the colonized, whose being was even negated in terms of being human, right? And here I'm referring to the work of Mbembe and Fanon. Then when we want to recuperate ontology into our discussion, it is in a sense ontogeny, because when we're looking at ontology as a process of becoming, of bringing into being, and we're looking at this as being a historical process. So from a decolonial perspective, ontology is not just existence or not, it's coming into existence of those who were made invisible in previous colonial discourse, much of it anthropological. Right?
Yes. Well, I'm not going to apologize for my anthropological ancestors, but they've been and they've gone, and there's nothing we can do about them. But it does put anthropology in that difficult situation. Most disciplines like to celebrate their ancestors. Anthropology has a bit of a problem with that, and it's always been a sort of curse around our necks that we can't do it. But one thing is I take your point, but there's a certain understanding of history that underpins it, and I think I would want to say, though I'm not sure whether I could do it on the spot, but I would want to argue that history and what I mean by ontogeny are not quite the same things, or that actually that they rest on slightly different premises. The premise of ontogeny, as I'm accepting it, is that we live in a world that is fundamentally a world of relations, and that world is continually unfolding, which means that in whatever we do, we contribute to that unfolding, but we contribute from the inside of it. And in fact, I always think that everything is really a footnote to Marx's famous statement in the 18th Brumaire, that men, sorry about men, but men make their own history, but not under circumstances of their own choosing, but under circumstances given and generated from the past. And I mean, that really, for me, just about everything else is a footnote to that, because what he says there is that that this becoming of the world, if we call it history, it is something that we make, that comes about through deliberate human activity, but that every human finds themselves as a maker within a field of relations which they did nothing to establish. You can't just decide, oh, I wish that I'd been born in a different part of the world or in a different era. We come into the world where we do, and we have to pick it up from there. And so what I'm thinking about in terms of ontogenesis is the continual unfolding of that field of relationships. And one implication of that is that it is not a field that is limited to humans, because our relationships embrace all sorts of non-humans, more than humans, whatever you want to call them, as well. And their lives are conditioned by what we do, just as our lives are conditioned by what they do. So we're talking about a field of relationships which is indefinitely extendable. It has no boundaries to it. If you wheel the concept of history in, is that we run into the problem of how we can accommodate history within a conception of the unfolding of the life world as a whole. We can do that. We would probably have to rethink a lot of the assumptions that historians. That's probably as far as I can go here. Time constraints.
Okay, Gary, you wanted to say something.
Sorry, I always have to unmode and remote. So,
Oh, okay. Yes.
I always have to unmode and remote. But let me start
Okay.
video that I'm not so impersonal. Hi, everyone.
Oh, there you are.
Yes, yeah, I am. Sorry. I have to switch it on and off for connectivity. So I'm trying to save data. In all of that, I think that is, when Sinfree brought me in, and the thing I'm wondering about, you mentioned things like we as anthropologists, we have things, so there seems to be, for me, the background is always the discipline of anthropology exists and should continue to exist as we are moving on. So we have ancestors we don't, we're not really proud of, but in a way we still continue. And isn't actually one way forward perhaps to question in all of this, and I think that might bring our debates around humanity forward, that we stop dividing us into disciplines and that we start thinking very differently. Because one of the things is also when we kind of position ourselves as academics and we have disciplines and we have things to say because we have thought about them, we immediately imply that there's a particular training which is disciplinary, which gets us to that point. So what will happen to all these debates we're having about ontogeny, ontology, humanity, becoming human, once we break down those boundaries and we do not assume, because what goes with the boundaries is a training program and a set of disciplinary conventions. What happens then to all these debates?
Okay, well, it's a question of how we conceive of the discipline, and I think of anthropology as a disciplinary anti-discipline. And anthropology is fundamentally anti-disciplinary insofar as it refutes the idea of the discipline as a bounded territory of knowledge. It refutes that. And in its place, it installs an idea of the discipline as a conversation, a momentary, maybe not particularly long-lasting entanglement of voices. And if you think of all the voices of all the scholars that have ever lived, and you think of them as a great mesh of overlapping voices that sometimes tangle with one another, sometimes don't, sometimes come together, sometimes split apart. And if you were to look at that whole mesh, you would see nodes sometimes appearing, or areas of great density. And then you'd see lines spiraling off in different sorts of directions to join other nodes. And those nodes, those knots, those conversations are what we call disciplines. Now, there's a myth that's been put around, above all by university administrators and funders, that academics in their disciplines live in silos, and they're locked up in their disciplinary prisons. And I find that offensive. It makes me really angry when people talk like that, because at least in the humanities and social sciences, maybe it's different in the natural sciences, I don't know, but in the humanities and the social sciences, that has never, ever been the case. Disciplines have always spiraled off in all sorts of different directions wherever the conversation has wanted to go. And to prove that, you only have to look at a half-decent article published in a journal in any social science or humanities discipline you like, sociology, history, anthropology, linguistics, you name it, law. Look at an article in a journal published in the last 100 years, 150 years, and look at the bibliography and say, where do the articles, where do the works that are referred to in the bibliography, where do they come from? Who are the people who wrote them? And you will find that they're from all over the place. That if it's a decent piece of scholarship, that scholar will have read things and picked things up and refer to them because they've been relevant or helpful or useful for the particular topic that is being developed. And that has always been the case. So what we have to resist is the managers who are trying to force on us a territorial concept of the discipline. And they're doing that in the name of interdisciplinarity, because they're thinking of interdisciplinarity in rather the same way as politicians think of international relations, that we have these territories. And then we have to have international agreements in order to allow commerce to take place between these different territories. We have to build bridges between them. And that actually reinforces boundaries. It doesn't break them down. So what I've been trying to do is to replace that territorial conception of knowledge as a conception. I've been using this word, the meshwork, to refer not the network. Network is connecting points. So the meshwork is all these lines that are getting woven together and sometimes splitting apart to make a kind of fabric. And to think of every scholarly life as one particular line, which then in the course of its unfolding gets tangled up with other lines, other people that the scholar is engaging with, the work that they're engaging with, and sometimes comes together, sometimes splits apart. And that's the way in which the whole scholarly thing proceeds. And yes, if I use the phrase "we as anthropologists," I kind of apologize. It's not a good phrase, and yet I still believe, when I wrote this little book, Anthropology: Why It Matters, and I really believe it does matter. I think the world desperately needs anthropology, and that anthropology can offer an alternative model to how to do intellectual work in the world that we're in, to the normal science model that dominates the current university. I think it offers a model for the university of the future. And it's in that sense that I want to promote it. And yes, training does matter, because you also have to think about the next generations, the kids who are going to school and then going to university, and those children are our future. And we have to be able to tell them things. And if we call that training, it maybe sort of rather spoils it a bit, but we have to tell them things. We have to bring them along in a process of education, which doesn't mean telling them what they're supposed to know, but it means that we want them to join with us. And as we have learned, it's our obligation, and we've been transformed by our learning, it's our obligation to transform the generations that come after us. So we just need a language that that enables us to express this. And perhaps words like discipline and training and so on are not the best words. But we must have education. And that's why I've been trying to argue in all this discussion about anthropology and ethnography, I've been trying to argue that anthropology is basically a form not of ethnography, but of education. Education as a way of learning from others and exposing oneself to the possibilities of doing things differently.
Can
I'll jump in, Ashraf. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. Just like anyone here, been enjoying this discussion. Today I had the feeling that you are trying to rehabilitate the discipline of anthropology. My question is, how do you think other forms of non-Western anthropology, like the Islamic anthropology, for example, anthropology which is found in the Arab world, can help you in this process of rehabilitation?
It can help in the sense that we need to, I keep coming back to this idea of the conversation, which is that we have to keep on talking to one another, and the thing about conversations is that they are collective things, they're collective processes, they are open, and they are creative, and they have no determinate outcome. I mean, they simply carry on, and there's no way of knowing at any particular point what way they're going to go. And it seems to me that that this conversation can proceed so long as we do not a priori wrap up particular bodies of knowledge within some kind of paradigm, as if to say, this here, this thing here, this is Western anthropology. This thing here is Islamic anthropology. This thing here is, and so on and so forth. If we wrap things up into packages and demand then some kind of commerce between these packages, it's not going to work. But if we allow each of those to be multivocal in themselves, to allow that there is no such thing, after all, as often been pointed out, as Western thought. Western thought is a convenient construct in which you can put in a whole lot of things and certain assumptions and what follows. But we all know that no scholar in the history of the so-called Western world has ever done Western thought. They've been thinking whatever way they have, but things get packaged, particularly when you're trying to teach students on courses and they want to know what to put on their exams, and so they put down Western thought without thinking about, is there ever such a thing? I don't think either there can be such a thing as Islamic thought or any other kind of thought in that sense. But people can influence one another and they can learn from one another, and that's fine. So my feeling is that so long as we're prepared to allow for polyvocality, as long as we're prepared to allow for everybody to have their own voice, and to say that in scholarship we speak with our voices, then the conversation can carry on and we can all learn from one another without having to say, oh, this is Western, this is Islamic, or whatever it might be. It's these labels are so damaging because they kind of put somebody in a box even before they've had a chance to say anything.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I partly agree, because we're dealing with boxes in the end of the day, but the boxes are there, and how to dismantle them From inside, you have to use the boxes. You see what I mean? For example, the word conversation itself presupposes the existence of boxes, because there's some kind of assumed boundaries you have to work from. And this will lead me to the idea of the line as a metaphor, and rejection of the word interaction, and instead you prefer the term correspondences, which is the lines and the relationship between those lines. Again, the problem is that again we'll be back to the boxes, because the lines here predate the process of interaction. Where do those lines come from? You see what I mean?
You're right, and it points to what many people have identified as the weakness of my own work, and that is that I've not dealt adequately with the political. I mean, what you could argue is that the boxes that are themselves things that have emerged out of previous histories they're historical formations of the kind that we are settled with, and they are so constraining, they're so difficult to deal with, because a lot of political power is holding them up, and so that means that thinking about and with lines as a way to break down those boxes itself becomes a political project, and if there's a weakness or a gap in my writing that I'm be perfectly willing to own up for, it's because I've not dealt explicitly with that political aspect. My defense is that I think that writing against the grain is itself a political act, but clearly that's where the politics comes in, about when we start thinking, well, how do we, if we got lines and we got boxes or blocks, how are the lines going to overcome the blocks? and that's a political problem.
I would like to bring in here Magda, because she writes about entanglement. And when you were talking about how disciplines may be momentary entanglement.
Sinfree, do you mind if I ask a question?
Oh, you can do whatever you want.
So,
if I may just point out that we're reaching the end soon, so perhaps with Mari's last question, and then with Magda's contribution that Sinfree will make, and then we can round it up. Yeah.
Okay, so the last question was related to sort of the political dimension. Mine is connected to affective dimension. I've been reading post-humanism theories for 4 or 5 years and struggling with some of the concepts, but affect is something that I'm really attracted to. And you talk about walking is really embodiment, and I really like your idea of an ecological awareness, the science with ecological awareness, this open-ended inquiry. So my question is, how are you thinking about embodiment in your work?
I'm actually, thank you for the question, because I can't remember what I said about it in The Life of Lines, but at least more recently, I really don't like the concept of embodiment. I've really taken against it, and because of the implication somehow that things are packaged in the body. I want to think of the body as animate, rather than and what we do as being animate. That is, as a body that it's perfectly fine, for example, to say that walking is a bodily activity. Obviously it is. We walk with our bodies. We couldn't walk if we didn't have bodies. So walking is a bodily activity, yes. But to say that walking is an embodied practice is another thing altogether. And there's a switch that comes from bodily to embodied, because in the embodied, it's like you're taking it in and depositing it, sedimenting it within this body. And I think that is fundamentally mistaken.
Right, that wasn't really the point of my question, and I think I sort of misconstrued it, but it affect, more to do with affect and intensity. You know, like you experience things intensely together with inanimate and animate beings. So how are you theorizing this sort of affect? Or do you think it's a concept?
It is. I think it's a concept that's been somewhat overdone, and it's because of the influence of people bringing in Spinoza. But I think it goes back to the discussion we had earlier about going from nouns to verbs. Because for me, the affective, you get to the affect by moving to the verb. That's the affective dimension. It's about what stuff does. So if with materials, what materials do, how they respond, how they behave, how they act. That's the affective dimension. I've explored it for it myself. I play the cello, and I think about, well, what's happening when I play the cello? And at the moment when I begin to play, there's no longer me attached anatomically to the instrument and interacting with it. What happens is the instrument falls apart and becomes wood, metal, rosin, air, and my body too falls apart, and then there's sort of this kind of explosion, and all these materials start going along together, and that going along together erupts into sound. I mean, that's the way it. That's so at the moment where the affect comes in, where it's not me and this cello, but me playing when I'm actually there in the middle of performance. That's where the affective dimension comes in, and everything is in movement, in process. The wood is vibrating, the strings are vibrating, the friction of the bow hairs against the string, all this stuff that is going along together, and everything suspended in movement, really. So that for me is where the affective dimension comes in. We think of everything verbally in terms of it's going along in the world, it's doing its activity. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. It's Magda, I think I talk about entanglement.
Yeah, sure. I'm.
Hello. I can see you.
We should be finishing. So I don't want to take too much time, but maybe the only thought I would like to share is while I'm wondering about my trajectory as a researcher and humaning and the wording around me, I was thinking about kind of tuning into and the correspondence with the word, because while I'm wandering or walking, the word is changing, the word is moving, and now I'm changing as well. And it's so interesting to see, because every scholar that we ask a question about their work, they would say, oh, I changed my my way of thinking. And it's so accelerated. Even, like the work that I have written a month ago and I come back, I have to make so many changes because I'm not the same person as I was a month ago. Yeah,
I know. Yes. And this is for anyone who writes, this is a constant problem, isn't it? It means that you can never you never feel satisfied with the work. There's a moment at which you have to submit something to a publisher, and that's it, and you can't do anything more, and there it is. But by 2 days later, you're already thinking somewhere far ahead and wishing you'd never written those sentences. That's just the way it is. I mean, think about it the other way. Suppose that you actually said, right, I've written this, it's finished now, and later on you look back at it and you said, yes, that's exactly what I meant to say. And a year later, you're saying, yes, that's exactly it. That you hadn't moved on at all, then you would have serious cause for concern. So that perhaps the fact that when you look back at what you've written before, you feel less than satisfied sometimes can be understood positively. It shows that that life moves on and ideas move on.
Right. I would like to thank Tim for finding time to discuss with us his work. And I would also like to thank everyone who has participated from across the globe. It must be midnight for some people and afternoon in other parts of the world. Our next encounter, so to speak, is sometime in, is it June or July, Magda? When is it?
It's in June.
It's in June. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, and we will send you notices. And Tim, if you happen to have time to waste, please do join us. But it won't be you talking about your work. It will be some two authors talking about their work, but they'll be talking about language, colonialism, and capitalism. So what you've been talking about is a good transition to what they will be discussing. And sometime in March, April, Raphael and Magda and myself are thinking of having what we call an academic festival in which we have all the authors who have talked about their work in a panel, and then we can have a conversation with them as well. But that academic festival will take place sometime in March, April. It depends on Magda and Raphael putting together the logistics about how to work these things, and I'll ever do.
Okay.
Thank you very much to everybody. Raphael, do you have anything?
Sinfree?
Yes.
I was trying to save the chat, and I'm not quite sure if I was able to do it.
Oh.
If the organizer could save the chat,
we did save it. Yes, we did save it. We did save it. We can be able to distribute it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. The plan is going to be that for the book by Monica Heller and Bonnie McQueenie, we are thinking of producing what we call a book about a book that is commentary on their particular book, right? So you respond to the particular book, and after this conversation, and we can write short chapters concerning your own responses to that particular book. Right. Anyway, Raphael, do you have anything to say?
Well, just to say that I'm going to send an email next week with details about our next meeting, 17th of June. 2 p.m. Oslo time. It's hard to say everyone's time, but I was very, very happy to see that perhaps we had more people, but at some point we had 28 participants, which is amazing. So thank you everyone for participating, and you're welcome to participate in our next or the upcoming meetings. Your questions were very important because it made this discussion with Tim so interesting. And thanks again, Tim, for so generously accepting to join our discussion.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
It has been a pleasure. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I have a last thing. There's a question in the chat, please.
Okay, yes.
There's a question. Somebody asked a question in the chat. Raphael, if you can have them, if you can read that question.
I see many thank yous.
No, it's from Christine.
What is the question?
Oh yes, I had just asked, but it's in the end. I mean, the question is: if engaging dialogue is so central, in what language does dialogue take place? Because I've been working with language policy, so what's the meaning of language there? Or
actually, the question about translation. Yeah. The ideal answer is that everybody should be multilingual. I mean, obviously, nobody can speak all the languages in the world, but at the moment we are settled with this English language colonialism, which is just terrible, and many dominant disciplines are just assuming that, well, everything's in English now, or maybe English and Spanish, or English and French, or maybe one or two others, but that's it. One of the great things about anthropology is that all anthropologists have to become very conversant in the language of whoever they're working with, and it often means that we have this imposes quite major linguistic challenges for all of us. But that's a very good thing, because language is not just an encoding of thought. It actually it's a thinking in itself, and so different languages give us different ways of thinking about things, and so. In my view, the ideal thing would be to work towards the kind of situation that actually existed for the greater part of human history. Anybody, just scholars, would normally be conversant in 5 or 6 languages. That was normal on the continent of Australia, for example. Aboriginal people would normally speak the language of their group and the language of 5 or 6 other groups, which they border their own. It's a tragedy, I think, that language learning has been so downgraded in so many countries, and the United Kingdom is perhaps the worst offender, because here English is our native language. So a dialogue can take place across languages. That's the only thing. Let's have more multilingualism.
If you've got any questions, feel free to send them to Raphael, and you can forward them to Tim, and we can continue the conversation.
Okay.
Okay, good. Right.
Right. Well, we're finished.
Yes. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye for now.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Right.